At my birthday dinner, my mother leaned over my father and whispered, "Tell your daughter to go change the locks at her apartment while she is busy paying the bill." My sister smirked, nodded, and slipped away. 2 hours later, she returned paler than the linen tablecloth, leaning in to gasp out that federal agents were swarming the lobby, looking for her husband. My name is Ebony. I am 32 years old, and I am the founder and chief executive officer of a property technology firm managing luxury high-rises across the country. My family believed I was a struggling failure. Before I share exactly how this unforgettable night unfolded, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family that constantly underestimated your worth. The evening began at one of the most exclusive French restaurants in the heart of Atlanta. It was my 32nd birthday, but you would never know it by looking at the people sitting around the table. My mother, Vivian, had selected the venue specifically because she knew it was outrageously expensive. She wore a designer dress that she likely purchased on credit, her posture rigid with the desperate need to project high society wealth. My father, Jerome, sat beside her wearing his custom-tailored suit, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of a successful real estate mogul despite the fact that his boutique brokerage was bleeding money. Across from me sat my older sister Chantel, draped in flashy jewelry and clinging to the arm of her husband Preston. Preston was a cocky finance bro who used his background and corporate jargon to manipulate my parents into treating him like a financial deity. The waiter approached our table carrying a silver tray with a bottle of vintage champagne that cost more than my first car. My mother had ordered it without consulting anyone, and naturally she expected me to foot the bill. I sat quietly in my seat, slicing into my medium-rare steak, watching the performance unfold. I wore a simple black dress, deliberately choosing an outfit that did not scream wealth. I had spent the last 5 years building an empire from the ground up, securing millions in venture capital and revolutionizing the property management industry. Yet to the people sitting at this table, I was just the rebellious daughter who refused to take a receptionist job at her father's failing company. "You know, Ebony," my mother announced, her voice carrying across the elegant dining room loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "You are extremely lucky we even include you in these dinners. Pity goes a long way. I really hope you are saving some of your little paychecks because this lifestyle is clearly out of your tax bracket." I chewed my steak slowly, savoring the rich flavor before taking a sip of sparkling water. I offered no emotional reaction, which I knew would only infuriate her more. She sighed heavily, swirling the expensive champagne in her glass. "I just do not understand where we went wrong with you. Chantel is married to a brilliant investment manager, living in a beautiful home, and you are still chasing this little app project of yours. It is embarrassing, Ebony. People at the church ask about you, and I have to make up excuses about why you are still renting a tiny apartment downtown, instead of building a real career." Preston chuckled, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. He swirled his own glass of champagne, his pale face flushed with arrogance. "Now, Vivian, do not be too hard on her," Preston said, using his classic condescending tone. "The tech sector is tough for people who do not understand market dynamics. Ebony is just playing in a very small sandbox. You see, Ebony, in the real world of multi-million-dollar hedge funds, we deal with actual capital leverage and algorithmic trading. Your little property app is cute, but it is not a scalable business model. You lack the fundamental synergy required to generate actual alpha. It is a harsh reality, but someone has to tell you." I looked at Preston, taking in his slicked back hair and his expensive watch. I knew exactly who he was and what he was doing. He was a master of throwing around meaningless corporate buzzwords to dazzle my parents, who were so eager to have a successful white son-in-law that they never questioned his actual business practices. They worshipped him, treating him like the ultimate authority on wealth and success, while actively looking down on their own flesh and blood. "That is very insightful, Preston," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "I will be sure to keep synergy in mind." My lack of a reaction clearly bothered my mother. She wanted me to argue, to cry, to defend myself so she could play the victim and call me aggressive or unstable. When I refused to give her the satisfaction, she turned to my father for reinforcement. Tell her, Jerome, my mother urged. Tell your daughter how the real world works. My father cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie as he looked at me with deep disappointment. Your mother is right, Ebony, he said, using his deep, authoritative voice that he reserved for closing real estate deals. I offered you a stable position at my brokerage 5 years ago. You could have been my lead receptionist. You could have learned the ropes of traditional real estate. Instead, you chose to walk away and waste your degree on some digital fantasy. He cut a piece of his lobster tail, shaking his head slowly. Real estate is about brick and mortar. It is about handshakes and networking in the community. You cannot disrupt an industry you do not understand. You have wasted your potential and now look at you. You are 32 years old, paying for dinner with credit cards you probably cannot afford to pay off just to pretend you can keep up with us. I placed my fork down on the pristine white plate, crossing my arms as I looked directly into my father's eyes. The truth was, I was not paying with credit cards I could not afford. I was paying with a black corporate card tied to an account holding more liquid cash than his brokerage had seen in a decade. Dad, I said, keeping my tone conversational but incredibly sharp. I appreciate the offer to be your receptionist, but considering your brokerage reported a 22% decline in revenue last quarter, and you recently lost your 3 biggest commercial listings to a rival firm, I think I am much safer managing my digital fantasy. The entire table went dead silent. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away as my words landed precisely where I intended. My father's face turned a deep shade of ash gray. His jaw tightened, and he gripped his butter knife so hard his knuckles turned pale. He had spent years projecting an image of untouchable financial success to his family, his church, and his community. Hearing his closely guarded financial failures exposed so casually and so accurately left him entirely speechless. "How dare you speak to your father that way?" My mother hissed, her eyes wide with shock and fury. "You have absolutely no respect. You are a bitter, jealous woman who cannot stand to see her family succeeding while you struggle in mediocrity." Chantel finally chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. "You are just mad because Preston is 10 times the business person you will ever be. He is closing deals that you could not even comprehend. You should be taking notes instead of making up lies about Dad." I simply smiled, picking up my glass of water again. "I am not mad, Chantel," I replied softly. "I am just highly observant." At that exact moment, the waiter arrived holding a black leather folio containing the bill. He placed it directly in front of me with a polite nod. The total was over $2,000. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I retrieved my sleek black metal card and placed it into the folio, handing it back to the waiter in one smooth motion. I did not flinch, I did not complain. I just paid for their excessive feast with the silent confidence of a woman who knew exactly what her time and peace of mind were worth. My mother glared at me, clearly frustrated that the massive bill had not elicited the panic or humiliation she had anticipated. She leaned over to my father, whispering fiercely in his ear, her eyes darting between me and Chantel. She thought I could not hear her over the classical music playing in the background, but years of having to protect myself in this family had made my senses razor sharp. I caught the whisper perfectly. "Tell your daughter to go change the locks at her apartment while she is busy paying the bill." My sister Chantel caught the subtle nod from my father. She smirked, looking at me with a sickening sense of superiority. "Excuse me, I need to use the restroom," she announced, standing up from the table and grabbing her designer clutch. As she brushed past the back of my chair, I felt a slight tug on my purse, which was hanging on the armrest. She was slipping my keys out of the side pocket. I knew exactly what they were planning. They assumed I lived in a low-rent apartment downtown, and they wanted to force me out, change the locks, and somehow manipulate the lease to benefit themselves, or perhaps just to assert absolute control over my life, and force me to crawl back to them for shelter. It was sick and twisted, but it was entirely on brand for my mother and sister. I did not stop her. I did not say a word. I simply let her walk out of the restaurant with my keys, knowing exactly where she was heading. She was heading to the most exclusive luxury high-rise in the city, where I occupied the top-floor penthouse. A penthouse secured by biometric scanners, private elevators, and an elite security team. But more importantly, she was heading to an address that my beloved brother-in-law, Preston, had secretly used to register his fraudulent shell companies, thinking I was merely a cleaning lady there. As Chantel disappeared toward the exit, I turned my attention back to the table. Preston was busy ordering an expensive post-dinner cognac, completely oblivious to the fact that his house of cards was about to collapse. My parents were whispering to each other, casting smug glances in my direction, believing they had just initiated a master plan to put me in my place. I sat back in my chair, enjoying the rich ambiance of the restaurant, the soft lighting, and the sweet taste of impending justice. The timer had started, and all I had to do was wait for the explosion. 2 hours ticked by with the agonizing crawl of a slow-moving train. I sat at that pristine white tablecloth, watching my family gorge themselves on my dime. My mother Vivian flagged down the waiter for a third time, ordering the most expensive chocolate soufflés and vanilla bean parfaits the restaurant had to offer. She was in her element, laughing loudly and projecting the image of a wealthy matriarch treating her family to a lavish birthday dinner. Of course, she conveniently left out the part where the birthday girl was paying the bill. My father, Jerome, leaned back in his chair, swirling his cognac and nodding along to Preston's endless corporate drivel. Preston was holding court, talking about offshore accounts and asset diversification, using big words to mask the fact that he was nothing more than a glorified con artist. I just sat there sipping my sparkling water. I did not check my phone. I did not look at my watch. I simply waited. I knew exactly what was happening across town at my building. My penthouse was located in the Zenith Tower, the most secure residential building in Atlanta. The elevators required biometric scans, and the concierge team was trained to intercept anyone who did not belong. Chantel walking in there with a stolen keycard and a bad attitude was never going to make it past the front desk. But what she was about to walk into was far worse than a strict concierge. She thought she was going to a rundown apartment to change the locks and force me out onto the street. She thought she was executing my mother's brilliant plan to steal my home and hand it over to her white husband. She had no idea that Preston had stolen my social security number months ago. He had assumed my address was just some commercial office building where I worked as the cleaning staff, so he used it to register his massive fraudulent hedge fund. He thought he was hiding his shell company under the radar of a poor black woman. He never realized he was registering his federal crime right at the front door of a property technology CEO. The dessert plates were almost empty when the heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open. Chantel practically fell through the entrance. The transformation in her appearance was breathtaking. 2 hours ago, she had strutted out of here dripping in arrogant confidence, carrying her designer clutch like a weapon. Now she looked like she had seen a ghost. Her face was completely drained of color, matching the stark white napkins on our table. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she stumbled past the host stand, completely ignoring the maitre d' who tried to stop her. My mother noticed her first. Vivian lowered her dessert spoon, her perfectly drawn eyebrows pulling together in a tight frown. "Chantel, what is wrong with you?" my mother demanded, her voice sharp and embarrassed by Chantel's frantic entrance. "You are making a scene, fix your face." But Chantel could not fix her face. She stumbled over to our table, completely bypassing her beloved husband, Preston. Her hands were shaking so violently that she had to grip the back of my mother's chair just to stay upright. She leaned down, her voice a frantic, terrified whisper that was still loud enough for me to hear over the soft jazz playing in the background. Mom Chantel choked out, her eyes darting wildly around the restaurant. "Mom, that address on the key card, it is not a rental apartment. It is the Zenith Tower. It is the top-floor penthouse." My mother froze. The annoyance on her face melted into sheer confusion. "What are you talking about?" Vivian whispered back, glaring at me before turning back to Chantel. "What do you mean, penthouse?" Chantel was hyperventilating now, tears welling up in her eyes, blurring her expensive mascara. "She owns it, Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The whole top floor." But that is not even the worst part. Mom, the lobby was full of federal agents. The FBI is swarming the entire building. They had the whole place locked down. I tried to use the key and they grabbed me. They questioned me for an hour. Mom, they are not looking for Ebony. They are looking for Preston. The silence that fell over our end of the table was absolute. The words seemed to hang in the air, suffocating the very breath out of my mother. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. My father, who had been mid-sip of his cognac, slowly lowered his glass, his eyes darting between his wife and his eldest daughter. But it was Preston's reaction that was the most satisfying. He had been leaning back in his chair, a picture of unearned white privilege and corporate arrogance. When Chantel's words finally registered in his brain, his entire body went rigid. The smug smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. His hand trembled so violently that the expensive crystal snifter slipped from his fingers. The glass shattered against the hardwood floor, sending amber liquid and crystal shards flying in every direction. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed through the elegant dining room, drawing stares from the wealthy patrons around us. "What did you just say?" Preston demanded, his voice entirely stripped of its usual smooth confidence. He sounded like a cornered rat. "What do you mean the feds are at the Zenith Tower?" Before Chantel could even open her mouth to repeat the nightmare, the heavy double doors of the restaurant opened again. This time, it was not a terrified sister making a scene. It was a coordinated tactical entry. 4 men and 2 women, all wearing dark suits and stern expressions, stepped into the dining room. Their presence instantly changed the atmosphere of the room. They moved with military precision, bypassing the host and scanning the tables. As the lead agent stepped fully into the light, he reached into his jacket and let a badge fall open against his chest. Federal Bureau of Investigation. My father stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His real estate mogul persona crumbled instantly, leaving behind a terrified older man who realized his family was suddenly the center of a federal spectacle. My mother pressed her hand over her mouth, stifling a gasp as she shrank back into her seat. Her precious social image, her obsession with church gossip and high society optics, was being burned to the ground right in front of her eyes. The agents did not hesitate. They marched straight toward our table, their eyes locked dead onto Preston. Preston scrambled backward, kicking his chair away. He looked wildly toward the kitchen doors, calculating an escape route, but 2 agents had already moved to block the exits. Preston Vance, the lead agent, said, his voice carrying the heavy weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft. Keep your hands where we can see them." I remained perfectly still, seated comfortably in my chair with my hands resting neatly in my lap. I watched as the golden child's perfect husband, the man my parents had elevated above their own flesh and blood, was forcefully grabbed by his tailored suit jacket and spun around. The sound of steel handcuffs clicking locked into place around his wrists was the sweetest symphony I had ever heard. "This is a mistake," Preston shouted, his voice cracking as panic set in. "You have the wrong person. I am a legitimate investment manager. You cannot do this to me. I demand to call my lawyer." The agents ignored his pathetic attempts to use his privilege to talk his way out of federal custody. They began reading him his rights right there in the middle of the dining room. Chantel let out a loud, dramatic wail, burying her face in her hands as her husband was paraded through the tables of shocked diners. My parents sat frozen in their seats, completely paralyzed by the destruction of their carefully curated reality. I took one final sip of my sparkling water, savoring the crisp coolness against my throat. My mother slowly turned her head to look at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and realization. She looked at me, not as the failure she had always claimed I was, but as the architect of the nightmare that was currently ripping her world apart. I just smiled back at her, a calm, chilling smile that told her everything she needed to know. The real dinner had just begun, and she was finally on the menu. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung shut behind the federal agents, taking Preston and his shattered ego with them. The silence that followed was suffocating. The elite patrons of the restaurant were staring at our table, their eyes wide with scandalized delight. My mother Vivian was trembling, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the white tablecloth so tightly her knuckles turned white. My father, Jerome, looked like a deflated balloon, all his arrogant posturing completely gone. Chantel was still sobbing loudly into her hands, mourning the sudden destruction of her fraudulent luxury lifestyle. I calmly reached for my napkin, dabbing the corners of my mouth before placing it neatly next to my empty plate. The utter stillness of my demeanor seemed to act as a trigger for my mother's shock to morph into unhinged rage. She slammed her hands flat against the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "What did you do? Ebony!" She hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that carried across the quiet dining room. "Did you set him up? Why are federal agents looking for my son-in-law at your building?" My father joined in, his face contorted with anger. "You malicious, vindictive girl!" he spat, leaning across the table. "You could not stand to see your sister happy with a successful man, so you called the authorities with some made-up story. You had him arrested at my birthday dinner." I looked at both of them, feeling a profound sense of disgust. Even now, with the FBI dragging their precious white son-in-law out in handcuffs, their first instinct was to protect him and blame me. They were so deeply conditioned to worship his perceived status that they could not even fathom he was a criminal. "I did not set him up, Dad," I replied, my voice smooth and chillingly calm. "Preston set himself up. The only reason the feds showed up at the Zenith Tower is because Preston used that address to register his fake hedge fund." Chantel lifted her tear-stained face, glaring at me with pure hatred. "Why would he use your building?" she cried out. "He does not even know where you live." "Exactly," I said, locking eyes with my sister. "He did not know where I lived. He knew I went to the Zenith Tower every day, but because of the lies you and Mom spread about me, he assumed I was working there as a cleaning lady. He thought it was the perfect cover. He stole my social security number from a family tax document Dad left out last Thanksgiving. He used my identity and the address of what he thought was a random commercial building to mask his shell company. He thought he was hiding his federal crimes behind the identity of a poor, struggling Black woman who would never have the resources to fight back if the authorities ever caught on." The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My father slumped back into his chair, his mind clearly struggling to process the reality of Preston's betrayal, but my mother simply shook her head, refusing to accept it. "You are lying," Vivian said, her voice trembling with denial. "Preston manages millions of dollars. He is a respected investment banker. He would never need to steal the identity of a failed app developer. You are just trying to ruin him." I stood up from the table, smoothing down my black dress. "Believe whatever you want, Mom," I said, picking up my purse. "But you might want to check the news tomorrow morning. And Dad, you might want to check your own company bank accounts. Rats like Preston do not just steal from their enemies. They drain their allies first." I walked out of the restaurant, leaving them to deal with the stares, the whispers, and the massive bill I had already paid. I stepped into the cool Atlanta night air, feeling a sense of absolute clarity. The first domino had fallen, but the war was far from over. The next morning, the fallout was swift and brutal. I sat in my penthouse office, sipping black coffee as I watched the local news channels. The story of Preston's arrest had already leaked. The media was having a field day with the scandal of a prominent Atlanta investment manager being hauled out of an exclusive French restaurant by federal agents. But my satisfaction was briefly interrupted when I saw the breaking news ticker at the bottom of the screen. Preston had been granted bail. He had retained one of the most ruthless, high-priced defense attorneys in the city, a man known for spinning media narratives and destroying witnesses. I knew instantly that the money used to pay that exorbitant retainer fee had not come from Preston's frozen assets. It had likely been drained from my father's struggling brokerage or hidden offshore. By noon, Preston and his lawyer held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps. I turned up the volume on my monitor, watching as Preston adjusted his tailored suit, looking somber and deeply wronged. His arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by the carefully practiced expression of an innocent victim. "My client is the victim of a sophisticated identity theft and corporate sabotage scheme," his lawyer announced to the flashing cameras. Mr. Vance was merely acting in an advisory capacity for a family member who lacked the financial literacy to manage her own startup. Then Preston stepped up to the microphones. He looked directly into the cameras and began to spin a racist gaslighting narrative so vile it made my blood boil. "I am deeply saddened by these false accusations," Preston said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "I tried to help my sister-in-law, Ebony. She is a bitter, financially unstable Black woman who has always harbored deep resentment toward my wife and our success. She manipulated me into signing advisory documents for her company, claiming she needed a white male presence to secure funding in the tech sector. I trusted her because she was family. I had no idea she was using those signatures to run a fraudulent shell company. She is the real mastermind behind this operation, and she is trying to frame me to save herself." I stared at the screen, completely disgusted but not entirely surprised. Preston was playing the oldest and most predictable card in the deck. He was using his white privilege and his polished corporate aesthetic to paint me as the angry, dishonest Black woman. He knew exactly how society conditioned people to view us. He knew that investors, the media, and even the justice system would be far more willing to believe that a struggling Black woman committed fraud out of desperation and spite than to believe a wealthy white man with a perfect smile was a common thief. He was weaponizing every stereotype, every racial bias, and every societal prejudice against me to save his own skin. He thought that his tailored suit and his pale skin would automatically grant him the benefit of the doubt, while my Blackness would automatically render me guilty in the court of public opinion. But the truly heartbreaking part was not Preston's predictable racism. The heartbreaking part was what happened next. My phone began to buzz frantically. The family group chat, which had been silent since the restaurant incident, suddenly exploded with messages. I opened the chat to find a barrage of accusations from my own parents and sister. Chantel texted first. "I cannot believe you would do this to us. Preston was just trying to help your pathetic business and you set him up to take the fall for your crimes. You are a monster, Ebony." My mother immediately chimed in, validating Preston's lies. "I always knew you were jealous of your sister, but trying to send her innocent husband to federal prison is pure evil. You are no daughter of mine. You need to confess to the authorities immediately and clear his name before you ruin our entire family reputation. What will the people at church say when they hear you are a criminal?" My father, the man whose own business was currently being hollowed out by the very son-in-law he was defending, sent the final crushing message. "Preston explained everything to us this morning. We know about the documents you tricked him into signing. We are coming over to your building right now. You are going to sign a full confession and take responsibility for your actions, or I will personally ensure you are locked away for a very long time." I set my phone face down on the sleek glass surface of my desk. They had swallowed Preston's lies without a single second of hesitation. He had played them perfectly. He used corporate jargon to confuse my father. He played on my mother's obsession with social status, and he leveraged Chantel's desperate need to keep her luxury lifestyle intact. They were so blinded by their own internalized prejudices and their worship of Preston's whiteness that they willingly threw their own Black daughter to the wolves. They genuinely believed that I, a woman who had spent years mastering property technology, building algorithms, and securing elite real estate portfolios, was too incompetent to run a business without a white man's help. They believed I was just a bitter failure who dragged her glorious brother-in-law into the mud. I leaned back in my leather office chair, taking a deep breath of the cool, air-conditioned air of my penthouse. I felt no sadness. I felt no grief for the family I was losing. Any lingering shred of familial loyalty I had left was completely incinerated by their willingness to destroy me for him. Preston thought his privilege was an impenetrable shield. He thought his expensive lawyer and his media spin would be enough to crush me. He thought he could use my identity as a weapon against me, and that I would just cower in the shadows like I did when I was a teenager living under my parents' toxic roof. He was wrong. He did not know that every single wire transfer he had ever made was meticulously tracked through my proprietary software. He did not know that I had already secured the digital footprints of his offshore accounts, tracing exactly how he had been funneling money out of my father's brokerage to pay off his angry investors. And he certainly did not know that while he was busy holding press conferences to play the victim, I was actively acquiring the very debt that kept my father's business afloat. My family wanted a villain. Preston wanted a scapegoat. They were all about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you corner a woman who has already built the cage around you. I picked up my phone and called the head of my private security detail. "We have guests arriving soon," I told him, my voice steady and cold. "My parents and my sister. Let them up to the penthouse floor, but make sure your team is stationed right outside the door. They are going to try to force me to sign a confession. When I give the signal, I want them escorted off the property and permanently banned from the premises." I ended the call and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling skyline of Atlanta. The city was bustling with life, completely unaware of the corporate warfare brewing in the clouds above. My family was on their way up here right now, carrying legal documents and empty threats, trying to force me to sacrifice my freedom to save a parasite. They thought they were walking into the apartment of a struggling, desperate woman. They had no idea they were walking directly into the lion's den. I smoothed the fabric of my tailored blazer, checking my reflection in the glass. I was completely ready for them. The soft chime of the private elevator echoed through the massive foyer of my penthouse, signaling their arrival. The heavy mahogany doors slid open, and there they stood. My mother, Vivian, my father, Jerome, and my sister, Chantel, stepped out onto the polished marble floor. For a fraction of a second, their manufactured rage faltered. I watched their eyes dart around the sprawling, open-concept living space, taking in the custom art, the vaulted ceilings, and the panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline. They had come here expecting a cramped, dingy apartment. Instead, they were standing in a multi-million-dollar fortress of glass and steel. But their shock quickly morphed back into that familiar, entitled hostility. My family never let reality get in the way of their delusions. Jerome marched forward, his designer dress shoes clicking loudly against the marble. He did not bother with a greeting. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, slamming them down onto the center of my black quartz kitchen island. The sharp smack of the paper hitting the stone rang out like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Sign it, Ebony." My father ordered, his voice dripping with that same patriarchal authority he had used to control us my entire life. "We are not playing games with you today. Preston is facing federal indictment because of your careless behavior, and you are going to fix it right now." I did not flinch. I slowly walked over to the island, resting my hands on the cool quartz. I glanced down at the documents. The heading at the top read, "Sworn Affidavit and Confession of Guilt." It was a meticulously drafted legal fantasy prepared by Preston's high-priced defense attorney. The document explicitly stated that I, Ebony Vance, was the sole architect of the shell company, that I had manipulated Preston into acting as a silent partner, and that he had absolutely no knowledge of the financial crimes committed using his signature. It was a complete fabrication designed to send me to federal prison for decades while completely exonerating him. "You brought a fraudulent confession to my home, and you expect me to sign away my freedom to save a thief?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying a lethal calm. Vivian stepped up beside my father, her face tight with a sickening mixture of panic and malice. "Do not use that tone with us," she snapped, her eyes glaring daggers at me. "Preston is not a thief. He is a respected investment manager who made a slight miscalculation because he was trying to help your failing business. You dragged him into this mess with your incompetence. You owe it to this family to take responsibility. If you just sign the paper, his lawyer said they can negotiate a plea deal for you. You might only serve a few years." I actually laughed. The sound bubbled up from my chest, completely devoid of humor. A few years in a federal penitentiary. My own mother was standing in my home, casually suggesting that I throw my life away, become a convicted felon, and sit in a prison cell just so her white son-in-law could continue playing pretend on the golf course. Chantel pushed her way to the front of the island. Her face was a mess of smeared makeup and puffy red eyes. She looked nothing like the arrogant woman who had stolen my keys at the restaurant. She looked desperate and pathetic. Ebony. Please, Chantel begged, her voice cracking as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. You have to do this. Preston would not survive prison. He is not built for that kind of environment. It would break him. He has a reputation to uphold. I stared at my older sister, feeling a wave of absolute disgust. He is facing prison because he stole millions of dollars, Chantel, I replied evenly. He is a criminal. He belongs in a cell. But you do not have anything to lose, Chantel cried out, her desperation making her voice shrill and hysterical. You do not have a husband. You do not have kids. You live all alone in this huge, empty place. Preston and I have a life to maintain. We have a family image to protect. If he goes to prison, I will lose everything. My friends at the country club will never look at me the same way. The church will gossip about me. My entire life will be ruined. You have to sign the papers, Ebony. You owe me. I am your sister. The sheer audacity of her sunk cost fallacy was breathtaking. She was explicitly telling me that my life, my freedom, and my future held absolutely zero value compared to her country club memberships and church gossip. She truly believed that because I was an unmarried Black woman with no children, my existence was entirely disposable. She viewed me as collateral damage, a sacrificial lamb to be slaughtered on the altar of her fragile suburban luxury. And what happens to my company? Chantel, I asked, tilting my head slightly. What happens to the hundreds of employees who rely on me? What happens to the investors who backed my vision? Your father scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. Nobody cares about your little app, Ebony. You can start another one when you get out. This is about real consequences. If you do not sign this confession right now, I will make sure you have no future left in this city anyway. Jerome leaned across the island, his face turning red as he delivered his ultimatum. I will publicly disown you. I will go to the pastor at the church and tell the entire congregation that you are a thief and a liar who tried to frame an innocent man. I will use every connection I have in the Atlanta business community to blacklist your name. You will be a pariah. No one will ever do business with you again. You will lose this fancy apartment you are renting, and you will be out on the street exactly where you belong. Sign the paper or you are no longer my daughter. They stood there shoulder to shoulder, a united front of toxicity and delusion. My father puffing out his chest with empty threats. My mother glaring at me with self-righteous fury. My sister weeping tears of pure selfishness. They expected me to break. They expected the little girl who used to crave their approval to resurface, apologize, and sign her life away just to keep the peace. I looked down at the documents again, the pristine white paper holding the key to my destruction. I reached out, picking up the thick stack of papers. Chantel let out a small breath of relief, thinking I was finally surrendering. My mother crossed her arms, looking vindicated. My father tapped his pen on the counter, waiting for my signature. I did not argue. I did not scream or cry or beg for them to love me. Those days were long gone. Instead, I turned my back on them and walked toward the corner of my home office area, which was separated from the kitchen by a sleek glass partition. What are you doing? My father demanded, his voice echoing in the large space. Bring that back here and sign it. I ignored him. I pressed a button on the top of my heavy-duty industrial paper shredder, a machine specifically designed to destroy highly confidential corporate documents. The machine hummed to life with a low, powerful grinding sound. Without a single moment of hesitation, I fed the entire stack of Preston's fabricated confession directly into the shredder's steel teeth. The machine chewed through the thick legal paper with a loud, aggressive crunching noise, destroying the document in a matter of seconds. No, Chantel shrieked, lunging forward as if she could somehow pull the shredded ribbons of paper back out of the machine. Are you crazy? Do you know what you just did? I turned off the shredder and slowly walked back to the kitchen island. I looked at the three of them, their faces frozen in absolute horror and disbelief. I know exactly what I did, I said, my voice dropping to an icy, terrifying calm. I just destroyed the only life raft your pathetic husband had left. And Dad, do not ever threaten to disown me again, because you cannot fire someone who quit 5 years ago. You have no power over me. You have no leverage. You have absolutely nothing. Vivian was shaking with rage. You arrogant, ungrateful little brat, she spat, stepping toward me with her hand raised as if she was going to strike me. I will teach you some respect. She did not even get the chance to fully raise her arm. I snapped my fingers, a single sharp sound that echoed through the penthouse. Instantly, the heavy doors of the private elevator lobby swung open. 4 massive private security guards stepped into the room. They were dressed in tactical black suits, their faces completely devoid of emotion. They moved with frightening speed, positioning themselves between me and my family, forming an impenetrable human wall of muscle and authority. What is the meaning of this? Jerome shouted, trying to puff out his chest and intimidate the guards, but looking entirely foolish in the process. I am her father. Tell these thugs to back off. The head of my security detail, a towering man named Marcus, crossed his arms and stared down at my father. Mom, do you want these individuals removed? Marcus asked, looking only at me completely, ignoring Jerome's blustering. Yes, Marcus, I replied, keeping my eyes locked on my family. These people are trespassing. Escort them off the property immediately, and ensure their biometrics are permanently scrubbed from the building access registry. They are never to be allowed within 500 feet of this tower again. You cannot do this to us, Chantel screamed as 2 of the guards took her by the arms and began to physically march her backward toward the elevator. I am your sister Ebony. You are ruining my life. My mother fought against the guards, gripping her desperately, trying to maintain her dignity, while being forcibly dragged across the marble floor. Let go of me, Vivian shrieked, kicking her designer heels. Ebony, tell them to let me go right now. You will burn in hell for treating your own mother this way. My father tried to wrestle his arm free from Marcus, but the security chief simply tightened his grip effortlessly, overpowering him and shoving him into the waiting elevator car. You are a disgrace to the Vance name. My father roared, his face purple with humiliation and rage as he was backed into the small space. You will pay for this, you hear me? You will pay for what you have done to us. I slowly walked up to the edge of the elevator doors, looking at the 3 of them clustered together in the small steel box surrounded by my security team. They looked small, pathetic, and entirely powerless. All their arrogance, all their entitlement had been stripped away in a matter of minutes. The Vance name is a joke, Dad, I said softly, leaning in slightly so only they could hear me. Your brokerage is bleeding out. Your golden son-in-law is facing 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. And your precious social standing is about to be dragged through the mud on every local news station in Atlanta. You threaten to destroy my reputation, but you are the one standing on the edge of a cliff. And the best part is, I do not even have to push you. You are all going to jump off entirely on your own. I stepped back and nodded to Marcus. Take out the trash, I said firmly. The heavy steel doors of the elevator slid shut, cutting off my mother's final hysterical scream and my sister's desperate sobbing. The mechanical hum of the elevator signaled their descent down to the ground floor, where they would be thrown out onto the bustling Atlanta streets like common trespassers. I stood alone in the grand foyer of my penthouse, the silence rushing back in to fill the space they had polluted with their toxic presence. I felt no guilt. I felt no lingering attachment to the people who had just been evicted from my life. They had come to my home to sacrifice me to save a white man who was stealing from them all. They had shown me their true colors in the most undeniable way possible. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering lights of the city spread out before me. The battle lines were permanently drawn now. There was no going back, no family dinners to suffer through, no fake apologies to endure. They had declared war, but they had brought a piece of paper to a nuclear fight. Preston was out on bail trying to control the media narrative. My parents were going to run straight to the church and the country club to spin their vicious lies about me. They thought casting me out would break me, They thought isolating me would make me surrender. They had no idea that isolation was exactly what I needed to finish the job. I walked back to my desk and opened my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The time for playing defense was officially over. It was time to systematically dismantle every single thing they held dear, starting with the very money they worshipped. I opened the encrypted files containing the detailed financial records of my father's failing brokerage and the offshore accounts Preston thought he had hidden so cleverly. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The eviction from my apartment was just the beginning. The real eviction from their life of luxury was about to commence. The Sunday morning after I threw my family out of my penthouse, they did exactly what I expected them to do. They went straight to our megachurch in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta to launch a full-scale smear campaign against me. My mother, Vivian, wore her most conservative designer dress and sat in the front pew weeping loudly enough for the entire congregation to hear. She made sure to dab her eyes with a lace handkerchief every time the pastor looked her way. My father Jerome stood by her side playing the role of the stoic, heartbroken patriarch. By the time the service ended and the congregation moved to the fellowship hall, the lies were already spreading like wildfire. My mother gathered her circle of church aunties and wealthy socialites, painting a picture of absolute betrayal. She told them that I was a deeply jealous and vindictive woman who could not stand to see my sister Chantel happily married to a successful white man. She spun a ridiculous narrative claiming that I had fabricated financial documents and called the FBI with an anonymous tip just to destroy Preston's flawless reputation. My father backed up every word, telling the church elders that I had lost my mind and that they were forced to cut ties with me for the safety of their family. They weaponized their religion and their social standing to turn my own community against me. My phone buzzed incessantly with text messages from cousins, family friends, and church members calling me a disgrace, a bitter black woman, and a traitor. They bought into Preston's white privilege so completely that they refused to believe a man who looked like him could ever commit federal fraud. To them, it was much easier to believe that the unmarried independent black daughter was simply acting out of spite. I did not shed a single tear over their gossip. I did not reply to the hateful messages, and I certainly did not try to defend myself to people who were so eager to see me as the villain. I simply put my phone on silent and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. Let them pray for Preston. Let them offer their sympathies to Chantel. They were entirely focused on preserving their fragile social optics while completely ignoring the massive financial crater opening up right beneath their feet. While my father was busy shaking hands and accepting prayers of comfort at the church, his beloved real estate brokerage was experiencing a catastrophic liquidity crisis. Jerome Vance had spent decades building his company into a recognizable name in the Atlanta commercial real estate market, but he had always struggled with actual cash flow. When Preston married Chantel, my father practically handed him the keys to the kingdom. He was so blinded by Preston's finance bro aesthetic and his promises of exponential growth that he gave him full executive access to the brokerage's primary operational accounts. Jerome thought he was securing his legacy, but he was actually giving a parasite a direct line to his lifeblood. What my father did not know was that Preston had been drowning in debt long before the FBI showed up at the restaurant. Preston's fake hedge fund was nothing more than a glorified Ponzi scheme, and his initial investors had started asking hard questions and demanding their returns. Desperate to buy time and keep the feds off his back, Preston had quietly siphoned millions of dollars directly out of my father's business accounts. He drained the payroll funds, the escrow accounts, and the operational reserves, using the money to quietly pay off the most aggressive investors. He bled my father's legacy dry to fund his own survival. By Monday morning, the reality of the situation began to hit the brokerage. Checks were bouncing. Commercial leases were falling through because the earnest money was gone. My father was sitting in his corner office, completely oblivious to the fact that his perfect white son-in-law had not just embarrassed the family, but had financially ruined them. Preston was out on bail, pacing around his luxury home, pretending to prepare a legal defense while secretly plotting his next move. They were all running out of time, and I was tracking every single second of it. I sat in my home office, bathed in the cool blue light of my multiple monitors. My property technology platform Zenith was not just a tool for managing luxury high-rises. It was powered by an advanced data analytics engine designed to track complex real estate transactions, verify funding sources, and monitor global market trends. It was a system built to detect fraud and ensure compliance, and right now I was using its full processing power to hunt Preston down digitally. I did not need a badge or a search warrant to find what Preston had hidden. I had access to the initial shell company filings that he had stupidly registered at my penthouse address. Using my proprietary software, I started pulling the threads of his digital footprint. I wrote custom algorithms to track the routing numbers he had used, cross-referencing them with public financial databases and international banking registries. The analytics engine worked flawlessly, chewing through massive amounts of data and highlighting the anomalies. The deeper I dug, the more the underlying rot of Preston's life was exposed. I watched the screen as the software mapped out a complex web of wire transfers. I traced the money flowing out of my father's commercial real estate accounts disguised as bogus vendor payments and consulting fees. Preston had created dozens of fake invoices, funneling the cash through domestic shell companies before moving it overseas. My analytics platform illuminated the final destinations with terrifying clarity. I found the offshore accounts tucked away in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. I uncovered hidden assets that Chantel knew absolutely nothing about. There were luxury properties registered under holding companies, high-end vehicles purchased in cash, and massive transfers to private crypto wallets. The paper trail was incredibly sloppy for someone who claimed to be a financial genius. Preston was not a mastermind. He was just a desperate man who relied on his race and his zip code to avoid scrutiny. I spent 3 days locked in my office, fueled by black coffee and the cold, calculating precision of a woman dismantling her enemies piece by piece. I compiled every single digital transaction, every forged signature, and every offshore routing number into a massive encrypted dossier. I cross-referenced the dates of the wire transfers with the timeline of my father's company, revealing exactly when and how the brokerage was fatally compromised. The evidence was irrefutable. Preston had not just defrauded his investors, he had systematically destroyed his in-laws to protect himself. And my father, the man who had threatened to ruin my reputation and cast me out of the family, was currently defending the very parasite that was eating him alive. My screen flashed as another automated alert popped up from my analytics software. It was a notification regarding the commercial debt portfolio I had instructed my corporate attorneys to monitor. My father's brokerage was officially in default on 3 major commercial loans. The banks were preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings on his primary office buildings in the south side of Atlanta, the very buildings he had arrogantly promised to hand over to Chantel and Preston as their grand inheritance. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk. The irony was almost too perfect. Jerome Vance was about to lose everything he had spent 40 years building, all because he trusted a white con artist over his own black daughter. He was about to face absolute financial ruin, and he was entirely, completely defenseless. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct number for my lead corporate attorney, a fierce black woman named Selena, who had helped me navigate the ruthless world of venture capital. She answered on the first ring, her tone crisp and professional. "Selena," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "The data mining is complete. I have the entire paper trail of Preston Vance's embezzlement, including the exact offshore accounts he used to hide the funds he stole from my father's brokerage." "Excellent," Selena replied. "The FBI will be very interested in this supplemental data, especially since his defense attorney is currently trying to paint you as the primary suspect. Having the money trail mapped out entirely clears you and buries him. Shall I forward the dossier to our contacts at the federal prosecutor's office?" "Yes," I said, watching the data scroll across my monitors. "Send them everything. But there is one more thing we need to execute first. The commercial loans for the Vance brokerage are officially in default. The banks are looking to offload the toxic debt. I want Zenith Corporation to step in and purchase those loans immediately." Selena paused for a moment, the rapid clicking of her keyboard echoing through the phone. "You want to buy your father's debt?" she asked, verifying the instruction. "You realize that means Zenith will become the primary creditor. You will essentially own his company and all its remaining assets." "That is exactly the point," I replied, my gaze drifting out the window toward the sprawling Atlanta skyline. "My father likes to boast about his legacy. He wants to leave his empire to Preston and Chantel. I think it is time I step in and take over the management of that legacy before Preston finishes burning it to the ground. Buy the debt, Selena. Pay whatever the banks are asking to expedite the transfer. I want full control of those loans by the end of the week." "Consider it done," she said, her voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. "They will not see this coming, Ebony." "They never do," I murmured, ending the call. I stood up and walked away from the monitors, letting the glow of the screens fade behind me. The smear campaign at the church meant absolutely nothing. The vicious text messages from my relatives were just white noise. They were playing a game of social optics while I was orchestrating a hostile financial takeover. My father was about to host a desperate pitch meeting to beg his local investors for a bailout. He was going to stand up in front of the Atlanta business elite and try to save his sinking ship, unaware that the hull was already torn open and the water was pouring in. He thought he could leverage his reputation to secure the funds needed to keep the doors open and protect Preston from the fallout. He had absolutely no idea that the bank no longer held his loans. He had no idea that the person who now held the keys to his entire empire was the same daughter he had ordered out of her own home. The trap was set, the exits were sealed, and all that was left was to walk through the front door and watch the kingdom fall. The Buckhead Country Club was a monument to old Atlanta money, the kind of place where generational wealth hid its sins behind towering marble columns and meticulously manicured golf courses. This was exactly where my father, Jerome Vance, decided to stage his last stand. He rented the grand ballroom, draping the impending death of his brokerage in silk table runners and overflowing floral centerpieces. He invited every major commercial investor, real estate developer, and wealthy church elder in the city, hoping to dazzle them into opening their checkbooks. It was an emergency pitch meeting disguised as a charity gala, a desperate plea for a financial bailout dressed up in a tuxedo. I watched the live feed from a tablet in the back of my sleek black town car, which was currently idling just beyond the country club gates. My father stood near the entrance, shaking hands with a rigid, frantic energy. His usual booming laugh sounded hollow tonight. He was sweating through his expensive suit, knowing that if he did not secure at least $5 million by Monday morning, his entire legacy would be auctioned off for pennies. My mother, Vivian, hovered next to him, wearing a forced smile that looked like a grimace. She was working the room, offering glasses of champagne to women who had just spent the entire week gossiping about our family scandal. She swallowed her pride to save her status, playing the gracious hostess while her world burned. But the most sickening part of the spectacle was Preston. He was out on federal bail wearing an ankle monitor tucked neatly beneath his designer trousers, and yet he had the absolute audacity to stand in the center of the ballroom, holding court. Chantel clung to his arm, looking pale and exhausted, but still playing the part of the devoted, wealthy wife. Preston was swirling a glass of bourbon, chatting up a group of older white investors who controlled significant capital in the Atlanta market. I listened to the audio feed transmitted from a small microphone my private investigator had slipped into the floral arrangement near the bar. Preston's voice oozed with that same sickening, unearned confidence. "It is just a bureaucratic witch hunt," Gentleman Preston said, chuckling as if facing 20 years in federal prison was simply a minor scheduling conflict. "You know how these federal regulators are. They see a successful portfolio and they want to dig through the paperwork. It is a temporary legal misunderstanding, a slight clerical error regarding some digital assets. My legal team expects the charges to be dropped entirely by the end of the month. In fact, I am personally guaranteeing a 12% return on any capital injected into the Vance brokerage tonight. We have massive commercial developments in the pipeline, and this liquidity bridge is just a mere formality." He was lying through his teeth. He was promising returns using money he had already stolen and spent on offshore accounts and mistresses. And the worst part was that the investors were nodding along. They were sipping their drinks, patting him on the back, and giving him the benefit of the doubt. His race, his suit, and his smooth corporate jargon created an invisible shield of credibility that protected him from the reality of his own crimes. My father watched from across the room, looking relieved that Preston was charming the crowd. Jerome actually believed that this white con artist was going to save him. I turned off the tablet and handed it to Selena, my lead corporate attorney, who was sitting perfectly poised in the seat next to me. She wore a sharp, dark-tailored suit and held a thick leather binder containing the legally binding deeds to every single commercial loan my father owed. "Are you ready to crash a party?" Selena asked, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. I adjusted the cuffs of my pristine white blazer. "I am not crashing, Selena," I replied calmly. "I am simply arriving to inspect my newly acquired property. Let us go." The heavy brass handles of the grand ballroom doors felt cold under my hands. Inside, my father had just taken the stage, tapping the microphone to get the crowd's attention. The low murmur of wealthy Atlanta elite quieted down as Jerome began his desperate pitch. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," my father said, his voice echoing through the speakers. "The Vance family has been a pillar of the Atlanta commercial real estate market for 4 decades. We have built neighborhoods, we have fostered growth, and we have always delivered for our investors. Tonight, we are offering a limited-time opportunity to partner with us on a revolutionary expansion." I pushed the doors open. The heavy wood glided silently, but my entrance was anything but quiet. I stepped into the grand ballroom, flanked by Selena and 3 other elite corporate litigators from my team. We moved with synchronized purpose, our heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor in a slow, steady rhythm. Heads began to turn. Whispers erupted at the back of the room and quickly spread forward like a wave. The investors, the church elders, and the socialites parted ways, allowing us to walk straight down the center aisle. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the stage. My mother noticed me first. Vivian dropped her champagne flute. The delicate crystals shattered against the floor, completely ignored by the crowd, whose attention was now entirely focused on my arrival. Chantel gasped, grabbing Preston's arm. Preston turned around, his fake smile instantly vanishing, replacing his arrogant facade with stark, naked panic. My father stopped speaking mid-sentence. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium, staring at me as if an apparition had just materialized in his country club. The silence in the ballroom became heavy, suffocating, and electric. "Ebony," my father hissed, leaning away from the microphone, but his voice still carried across the silent room. "What in the world are you doing here? You are strictly forbidden from attending this event. Security! I need security to escort this woman out immediately." I did not stop walking until I reached the very front row, standing just a few feet away from the elevated stage. The private security guards hired by the country club hesitated, unsure of how to handle a woman who exuded such absolute authority and was flanked by a team of terrifyingly calm lawyers. "Cancel the security, Dad," I said, my voice projecting clearly without the need for a microphone. "They cannot remove me from a building that is currently hosting an event funded by my capital." Jerome scoffed, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "What capital? You are a delusional girl who was just disowned by this family. You have no business being here. This is a private gathering for serious investors, not a place for you to throw a temper tantrum. Leave now before you embarrass yourself further." I smiled, a slow, cold expression that made my father grip the podium even tighter. "I am not here as your daughter, Jerome," I replied, dropping his title entirely. "I am here representing Zenith Corporation, the entity that just spent the last 48 hours aggressively purchasing the entirety of your defaulted commercial debt from every major bank in the state of Georgia." The ballroom erupted into chaotic gasps and frantic whispers. The investors, who had just been considering writing him checks, suddenly took a collective step back, looking at my father with extreme suspicion. Preston looked like he was about to vomit, his pale skin turning a sickly shade of green. "That is a lie," my father shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Zenith is a massive real estate conglomerate. You do not represent them. You do not have that kind of money. This is just another one of your vindictive stunts to ruin your sister's husband." I did not argue. I simply nodded to Selena. She stepped forward, unfastening the clasp of her leather binder. She pulled out a stack of legally certified documents bearing the official seals of the lending institutions my father had borrowed from. She calmly handed the stack to the nearest investor, a prominent Atlanta developer, who immediately began reading through the pages. "As the gentleman can verify," Selena announced to the room, her voice carrying the crisp, undeniable weight of legal truth. "My client, Ebony Vance, is the sole founder and chief executive officer of Zenith Corporation. She holds majority equity in the platform and has total executive control. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, Zenith Corporation legally acquired all outstanding commercial loans, mortgages, and lines of credit belonging to the Vance real estate brokerage. Mr. Vance is currently in default to the sum of $14 million. The developer holding the papers looked up at my father, his eyes wide with shock. "Jerome?" he said, his voice betraying his disbelief. "The signatures are verified. Zenith owns your entire portfolio. You are completely leveraged out to your own daughter." My father stumbled back from the podium as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened and closed, but he could not form a single word. All his pride, all his patriarchal dominance, all his desperate posturing completely evaporated. He was no longer the king of his empire. He was merely a tenant in mine. My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail, burying her face in her hands. The sheer humiliation of her social circle watching her husband be financially dismantled by the daughter she had just spent the entire week calling a failure was too much for her fragile ego to bear. Preston tried to intervene, attempting to salvage his own sinking ship. He stepped forward, forcing a nervous laugh and clapping his hands together. "All right, everyone, let us remain calm," Preston said, his voice shaking slightly. "This is clearly just a family dispute spilling over into the business sector. Zenith Corporation, or whatever this entity is simply acting as a debt aggregator. As the financial director of the Vance brokerage, I can assure you that we have the liquid capital to negotiate a settlement and restructure these loans. The brokerage is fundamentally sound." I turned my attention to Preston, my eyes sweeping over him with absolute disgust. "You really do not know when to stop lying. Do you, Preston?" I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic attempt at damage control. "You stand here promising these people returns, telling them your federal indictment is a simple misunderstanding while claiming the brokerage is fundamentally sound." I took a step closer to him, watching him instinctively shrink back. "But you and I both know that the brokerage has exactly zero liquid capital. We both know that you drained the payroll funds, the escrow accounts, and the operational reserves to pay off the angry investors from your fraudulent hedge fund." "That is defamation!" Preston shouted, his face turning bright red. "You have absolutely no proof of that. You are just a bitter, angry woman making wild accusations to ruin my life." I gestured to the audiovisual control booth at the back of the ballroom. My security team had already secured the room before I even walked through the front doors. "Hit the screen," I commanded. A massive projector screen descended from the ceiling directly behind my father. The room went dim as the bright light of the projector illuminated the space. The screen did not show the carefully curated slideshow my father had prepared for his pitch. Instead, it displayed a highly detailed digital map created by my analytics software. The map showed a web of financial transactions moving in real time. Every red line on the screen represented a wire transfer moving money out of the Vance brokerage operational accounts. The lines flowed across the digital map, moving through dummy domestic corporations before terminating in offshore bank accounts located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. Every single red line you see on that screen represents an illegal wire transfer authorized by Preston Vance. Over the last 14 months, I announced, projecting my voice so every person in the room could hear the undeniable truth. He embezzled a total of $4.2 million directly from my father's company. The ballroom was an absolute pandemonium. The wealthy investors who had just been moments away from writing bailout checks were now shouting for their lawyers and rushing toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the toxic fallout of the Vance family scandal. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, her designer dress crumpled beneath her. My father stood frozen on the stage, a broken man staring at the screen that broadcasted his ultimate failure to the entire world. I stood in the center of the chaos, perfectly calm, completely untouched by the destruction happening around me. I had not just kicked them out of my penthouse, I had systematically eradicated their entire reality. They had built their lives on lies optics and a profound disrespect for the only person who actually had the power to save them. I turned to Selena, who was calmly watching the wreckage unfold with a satisfied expression. "Draft the foreclosure notices," I told her, turning my back on my screaming family and walking toward the exit. "I want the locks on my father's office buildings changed by midnight." We walked out of the grand ballroom, leaving the burning ruins of the Vance legacy behind us. The cool night air felt refreshing against my face. The desperate pitch was over, and I had just bought the entire company for the price of their own ignorance. The morning sun rose over Atlanta, casting a golden glow over the city that I now effectively owned. I sat in the back of my town car, sipping a perfectly brewed black coffee as my driver pulled up to the glass facade of the Vance Commercial Real Estate headquarters. The locks had been changed at exactly midnight, just as I instructed. The lobby was a scene of absolute chaos. Jerome had called an emergency meeting with his board of directors and the primary investors who had attended the disastrous gala the night before. He was desperate to regain control, trying to convince them that the scene at the country club was just a theatrical stunt by a disgruntled daughter. He still believed his smooth talking and deep ties in the Atlanta church community could save him from the financial avalanche crashing down upon his head. I stepped out of the car, Selena and my legal team flanking me. We walked through the glass doors, bypassing the confused security guards, and headed straight for the executive elevators. My private security detail had already secured the top-floor boardroom where my father was attempting to hold his frantic meeting. We entered the boardroom. It was a massive, opulent space with a long mahogany table surrounded by angry, wealthy investors. Jerome stood at the head of the table, sweating profusely. His tie loosened his usual commanding presence, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. Chantel sat in the front row, clutching a tissue, looking completely hollowed out from the revelations of the previous night. Preston was miraculously there too, looking battered, but still clinging to the delusion that he could talk his way out of a federal indictment by throwing my father under the bus. I walked straight toward the front of the room. Jerome slammed his hands down on the mahogany wood. "Get out of my building, Ebony!" he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is a closed-door board meeting. You have no authority here. I am calling the police to have you arrested for trespassing." I did not even look at him. I simply set my tablet down on the table. One of the lead investors, an older gentleman who had done business with the Vance family for decades, raised his hand, silencing my father. "Sit down, Jerome," the investor commanded, his voice cold and unforgiving. "She is the CEO of Zenith Corporation. She holds the debt that you failed to pay. She has every right to be here, and frankly, she is the only reason any of us are still sitting in this room instead of pressing criminal charges against you personally." My father opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer hostility radiating from the men he once called friends forced him to collapse into his leather chair. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. He finally realized that his patriarchal authority meant absolutely nothing in a room governed by capital and ironclad contracts. I took the microphone that sat in the center of the boardroom table. My voice echoed through the built-in speakers, calm, steady, and utterly dominant. "Good morning, gentlemen," I began, my gaze sweeping over the anxious faces of the investors. "As you know, Zenith Corporation has acquired the entirety of the defaulted commercial debt owed by the Vance brokerage. We are now the primary creditor, and this building, along with all its associated assets, is officially under my executive control. I picked up a connection cable and plugged it directly into my tablet. The massive flat-screen monitor on the boardroom wall flickered to life. Last night, I gave you a brief overview of the embezzlement that crippled this brokerage. I continued typing a command into my tablet. But today, we are going to do a deep dive into the financial autopsy of Jerome Vance's legacy. I want you all to see exactly where your investments went. The screen populated with high-resolution scans of Preston's private bank statements. These were not the sanitized ledgers he had used to fool my father. These were the raw, unedited transaction histories obtained through my data analytics platform and verified by federal investigators. Preston sat frozen in his chair, his eyes locked on the screen. His arrogant white privilege, that invisible shield he had used to manipulate my black family for years, was completely useless in this room. The investors did not care about his tailored suit or his smooth country club demeanor. They only cared about the millions of dollars missing from their portfolios. Mr. Vance claimed that your money was lost in a series of unfortunate market downturns and complex algorithmic trading errors, I said, pulling up the first heavily highlighted document. He told my father that tech sector volatility was to blame for the missing capital. But the blockchain data and international routing numbers tell a very different story. He did not lose your money in the market, gentlemen. He never even invested it. I clicked to the next slide. A detailed receipt from a luxury maritime broker appeared on the screen. On October 14th of last year, Mr. Vance authorized a wire transfer of exactly $2 million from the brokerage's primary operational account. The funds were routed through a dummy corporation in Delaware before landing in the account of a yacht dealership in Miami. He used your commercial development funds to purchase an 80-foot Sunseeker yacht registered under a limited liability company that traces directly back to his personal tax identification number. The boardroom erupted into angry mutters. My father stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open in pure disbelief. He had trusted Preston implicitly, handing over the financial reins of his company because he was so eager to boast about having a brilliant finance bro for a son-in-law. Jerome had ignored all my warnings, treating me like a bitter failure, while the man he worshipped was literally stealing his empire out from under him. "It gets worse," I said, my voice cutting through the rising anger in the room. I clicked the remote again. The screen shifted to display a residential lease agreement for a luxury penthouse in the Buckhead district. The monthly rent was $15,000. Mr. Vance also used company escrow funds to secure a 2-year prepaid lease on this property, I explained, highlighting the signature at the bottom of the document. But he does not live there. The registered tenant is a 22-year-old former cocktail waitress named Madison. I pulled up the corresponding credit card statements showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in extravagant purchases. Mr. Vance provided her with a black card funded entirely by the Vance brokerage accounts. Over the last 8 months, he has spent $400,000 on designer bags, first-class flights to Paris, and diamond jewelry for a woman barely out of college. He funded a lavish double life using the money you all trusted my father to manage. Chantel let out a sound that I can only describe as the shattering of a human soul. She had been sitting in the front row trying to maintain some shred of her dignity after the humiliation at the gala. But seeing the bank statements, the lease agreements, the sheer volume of wealth her husband had showered on a 22-year-old mistress completely broke her. She doubled over in her chair, clutching her stomach as racking sobs tore through her body. All those late nights at the office, Chantel wailed, her voice raw and broken, echoing tragically in the large room. All those business trips to Miami. You told me you were building our future, Preston. You told me Ebony was crazy and that I needed to trust you. You took my father's money and gave it to some girl while I was defending you to my own family. You let my parents hate my sister so you could buy diamonds for a waitress. Preston did not even look at her. He stared blankly at the boardroom table, his jaw clenched tight. He was utterly exposed, a fraud stripped of his charming facade. He had no witty corporate jargon left to hide behind. The truth was glaring in stark high definition for everyone to see. My father buried his face in his trembling hands. The magnitude of his foolishness was finally crushing him. He had sacrificed his relationship with me, his own flesh and blood, just to appease a white man who viewed his business as nothing more than a personal ATM. Jerome had built the Vance brokerage over 4 decades, surviving recessions and market crashes, only to lose it all because of his own internalized prejudices and his desperate need for social validation. One of the investors slammed his fist on the table, pointing a shaking finger at my father. "You let this happen, Jerome," the investor yelled. "You were so blind, so busy playing the big shot at the country club, that you let this snake drain our accounts. We are going to sue you into oblivion. We will take your house, your cars, and everything you have left." I looked down at my father, feeling absolutely no pity. "Dad, you spent my entire life telling me I was a disappointment." I said, my words ringing clear in the chaotic room. "You called my tech company a digital fantasy. You told me I lacked the business acumen to succeed in the real world. You demanded I change the locks on my own home and sign a fraudulent confession to save this parasite sitting across from you." I stepped away from the microphone, walking slowly around the large mahogany table until I was standing directly behind Preston's chair. I leaned down slightly, my voice cold and precise. "You thought you could use my identity to hide your crimes, Preston. You thought because I was a black woman, you could easily frame me and the justice system would not blink an eye. You relied on my parents' toxic need for your approval to isolate me and tear me down." Preston swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing down the side of his pale face. He did not dare look at me. The investors were glaring at him with pure, unadulterated hatred. They were powerful men who did not take kindly to being robbed by a smooth-talking fraudster. "But you made one fatal miscalculation, Preston," I continued, stepping back and addressing the entire room. "You underestimated my intelligence, and you underestimated the power of my platform. Zenith Corporation does not just manage properties, it manages truth. Data does not lie. Numbers do not care about your race, your tailored suit, or your country club memberships. The data exposed exactly who you are, and it gave me the power to dismantle this entire operation overnight." I walked back to the front of the room, turning my attention to the angry investors. "Gentlemen, the Vance brokerage is finished. My father is stepping down effective immediately. Zenith Corporation is absorbing all commercial assets, and we are initiating a full liquidation of Mr. Vance's remaining personal properties to cover the outstanding debts. Furthermore, my legal team has already handed this complete financial dossier over to the federal prosecutor's office. We will cooperate fully with the FBI to ensure Mr. Vance faces the maximum penalty for securities fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement." The lead investor nodded slowly, a look of profound respect crossing his weathered face. The anger in his eyes faded into a cold, calculating acceptance of the new reality. "You have handled this masterfully, Ms. Vance," he said, using my professional title with a level of reverence my father had never afforded me. "We appreciate your transparency and your swift action in securing the assets. Zenith Corporation has our full support moving forward. We will deal directly with your legal team for the recovery of our funds." My father raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and filled with tears. "Ebony, please," he croaked, reaching a trembling hand out toward me across the mahogany table. "You cannot just take the company. It is my life's work. It is everything I have. I am your father. We can rebuild this together." "I was wrong about Preston. I was wrong about you. Just give me a chance to make it right." I stared at his outstretched hand, feeling completely hollow. There was no triumph in watching an old man beg. There was only the cold, hard reality of consequence. "You did not want to make it right when you showed up at my penthouse with a fake confession?" "Dad," I replied, my tone absolute and unwavering. "You did not want to make it right when you went to the church and told everyone I was a bitter, jealous liar. You only want to make it right now because you are holding a losing hand and I own the casino." I signaled to Selena, who began packing up the legal documents. Chantel was still sobbing uncontrollably in the front row. Her perfect suburban life, completely obliterated, her marriage revealed as a sham built on stolen money and lies. Preston remained frozen, paralyzed by the impending reality of a federal prison sentence. My father sat slumped in his chair, a deposed king surveying the ashes of his ruined empire. "The company is mine, Dad," I said, gathering my tablet and heading toward the boardroom doors. "And as for your life's work, you should have been more careful about who you trusted to guard it. My security team will escort you and your son-in-law off the premises. You have 1 hour to clear out your desks." I walked out of the boardroom, the heavy doors closing behind me, sealing the fate of the Vance family legacy. The hallway was quiet, the morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I took a deep breath, the air feeling crisp and clean. The boardroom bloodbath was over. The financial rot had been excised, and the truth was finally out in the open. I had walked into that building as the family disappointment, and I walked out as the sole owner of their entire world. As the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung shut behind me, the muted sounds of absolute destruction bled through the walls. My security team was moving in to escort them out, but Preston was not going quietly. I paused by the reception desk, watching the monitor of the internal security cameras. The wealthy investors had cornered my father, demanding their money back, jabbing their fingers into his chest. Jerome was stammering, entirely broken. Chantel was still sobbing, reaching out to grab Preston's arm, desperately seeking some sort of comfort or explanation from the man who had just publicly humiliated her. But Preston was completely unhinged. The polished finance bro facade was gone. He yanked his arm out of her grasp so violently that Chantel stumbled backward. "Do not touch me," he snarled, his voice echoing down the corridor. "You and your entire family are nothing but a bunch of gullible idiots. You handed me the keys to the kingdom because you were so desperate to show off a white husband at your pathetic country club. You practically begged me to steal from you." Chantel let out a heartbroken wail, reaching for him again. "Preston, please do not leave me," she cried. "What about our life? What about our image?" He shoved her hard. Chantel lost her footing and crashed to the marble floor, her designer dress tangling around her legs. "I do not care about your image," Preston spat, looking down at her with absolute disgust. "I am facing federal prison because your sister is a psychotic bitch. You are entirely useless to me now." He turned and sprinted toward the emergency stairwell, shoving past my father, who tried to block his path. Preston burst through the fire doors, leaving his weeping wife and ruined father behind. He thought he could run, but he was wearing a federal ankle monitor, and his passport had already been flagged. He was a rat fleeing a sinking ship, entirely unaware that the entire ocean was already on fire. The next 24 hours moved with the swift, brutal efficiency of a corporate execution. Zenith Corporation officially took possession of the Vance brokerage assets. The liquidation process began immediately. Moving trucks arrived at my father's commercial buildings, hauling away the lavish furniture and the expensive artwork he had used to project an image of untouchable wealth. The news of the seizure hit the local Atlanta business journals by noon. The Vance legacy was officially dead and buried. I spent the morning in my penthouse reviewing the transition documents with Selena. I was feeling a profound sense of closure. The toxicity that had plagued my life for 32 years was finally excised. But I had underestimated the sheer terrifying depth of my mother's delusions. The private elevator chimed softly. My security chief Marcus stepped into my office, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "Mom, your mother is in the ground floor lobby," Marcus said. "She bypassed the front desk and is demanding to speak with you. She says it is a matter of life and death regarding your sister." I let out a slow exhale, leaning back in my chair. I knew she would try to contact me, but showing up at my building after being permanently banned was a new level of desperation. "Bring her up to the private lounge," I told Marcus. "But keep 2 guards stationed inside the room. I want this over quickly." I walked into the lounge a few minutes later. The room was bathed in natural light, highlighting the expensive modern art and the panoramic views of the city. My mother Vivian stood in the center of the room. Despite the absolute devastation of her family, she was still wearing a pristine Chanel suit, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawlessly applied. She was clinging to her physical appearance like a life raft, completely incapable of accepting that her social standing was completely obliterated. When she saw me, she did not glare or shout. Instead, she practically threw herself across the room, collapsing onto her knees right in front of me. The sheer theatricality of the movement was staggering. The proud, arrogant matriarch of the Vance family was kneeling on my hardwood floor, her designer skirt pooling around her. "Ebony, please." My mother wept, her hands clasped together in a posture of desperate prayer. "Please, you have to help us. You are the only one who can fix this." I looked down at her, feeling a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. "Stand up, Mom," I said, my voice flat and completely devoid of sympathy. "Do not debase yourself in my home. What do you want?" She scrambled to her feet, wiping her carefully manufactured tears with a tissue. I expected her to finally apologize. I expected her to beg for forgiveness for treating me like a failure, for kicking me out of her life, for trying to force me to sign a fake confession. I thought that losing everything had finally broken through her massive ego and forced her to see the reality of her actions. But Vivian Vance was fundamentally incapable of remorse. "I need $1 million. Ebony," my mother said, her voice trembling with frantic urgency. "Just $1 million. It is nothing to you now. You just bought your father's entire company. You have millions to spare. I need you to write a check today before the banks close." I stared at her, genuinely baffled by the sheer audacity of her request. "You came to my home, fell on your knees, and begged me for $1 million, I asked slowly. "Why?" "So Dad can try to hire a defense attorney to fight the investors." "No," my mother said, waving her hand dismissively, as if my father's impending legal ruin was a minor inconvenience. "Jerome is dealing with the lawyers. This is about Chantel. It is about Preston." I crossed my arms, feeling the air in the room grow heavy with toxic absurdity. "Go on," I instructed her. "Preston is filing for divorce," Vivian cried, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "He told Chantel this morning. He is leaving her for that 22-year-old waitress. He says without the brokerage money, there is no reason for him to stay in this family." "Ebony, you cannot let this happen. You have to give me $1 million so I can pay off that little tramp Madison and make her go away. Then we can use the rest of the money to give Preston a golden parachute, a financial incentive to stay married to your sister. If we just give him enough cash, he will drop the divorce papers and stay with Chantel." I stood completely frozen. My brain struggled to comprehend the vile, sickening words coming out of my own mother's mouth. She was not here to save her husband. She was not here to apologize to the daughter she had abused for decades. She was here to ask me for $1 million to bribe a white criminal into staying married to her eldest daughter. "You want me to pay off Preston's mistress?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You want me to hand $1 million to the man who stole from our family? The man who tried to frame me for federal fraud? The man who shoved your daughter to the ground and called us all gullible idiots, just so he will not divorce Chantel?" Vivian nodded vigorously, completely blind to the absolute depravity of her own request. "Yes, exactly," she said, her eyes wide with frantic hope. "Ebony, you have to understand, we cannot have a divorced daughter in our family. It is shameful. The women at the church are already whispering about the business. If Chantel gets divorced, it will be a public scandal. The church will mock us. My friends at the country club will talk about us behind our backs. Chantel will be ruined. She will be a divorced black woman with a ruined reputation. No decent man will ever look at her again. We have to keep the marriage intact. It is the only way to save our social standing." The absolute sickness of her delusion hit me like a physical blow. She cared more about the gossip of a few hypocritical church elders and the fake smiles of her country club associates than she cared about her own daughter's safety and dignity. She was willing to buy her daughter a toxic, abusive criminal husband just to maintain the illusion of a perfect suburban life. She valued the proximity to Preston's whiteness and his fake wealth so much that she was willing to prostitute her own family to keep him around. "Mom," I said, stepping closer to her, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. Listen to me very carefully. Preston is a thief. He is a fraud. He is going to a federal penitentiary where he will spend the next decade wearing a jumpsuit that does not come from a designer boutique. And you want me to give him my hard-earned money so he can continue to humiliate your favorite daughter behind closed doors, just so you can walk into Sunday service with your head held high. Vivian flinched, but her deeply ingrained obsession with image immediately overrode any maternal instinct she had left. You do not understand because you have never cared about family tradition. She snapped, her tone turning defensive and harsh. You have always been rebellious and difficult. Chantel did everything right. She married well. She gave us a beautiful image. You are just trying to punish her, because you are jealous that she had a husband while you are all alone in this giant empty apartment. I let out a long, slow breath, shaking my head in pure disbelief. There was no saving her. There was no waking her up. The disease of her vanity was terminal. I am not punishing Chantel, I said, my voice cold and hollow. Chantel is punishing herself by refusing to walk away from a man who despises her. And you are punishing her by teaching her that her only value in this world is tied to a man who uses her as a shield for his crimes. I will not give you a single dime to fund your psychotic delusions. Vivian's face twisted with pure, unadulterated hatred. She lunged forward, grabbing my forearm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. You owe us, she screamed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. You took your father's company. You took our livelihood. You ruined my daughter's marriage with your digital witch hunt. The least you can do is fix the mess you created. Give me the money, Ebony. Write the check right now, or I swear to God I will curse your name until the day I die. I did not pull away. I simply looked down at her hand gripping my arm and then looked back up at her face. The security guard stepped forward ready to intervene, but I held up my hand, stopping them. You are already dead to me, Mom, I said softly, peeling her fingers off my arm with deliberate, terrifying precision. Your curses mean absolutely nothing to a woman who built her own blessings. You came here begging for $1 million to save your reputation. But your reputation is already ash. The church is already laughing at you. The country club has already revoked your membership. You have nothing left because you valued a white con artist over your own black daughter. I stepped back, signaling to Marcus. Vivian stumbled backward, her face pale, her mouth trembling as the absolute finality of my words finally pierced through her thick skull. Escort her out, Marcus, I commanded, turning my back on the woman who gave birth to me. And if she ever sets foot in this lobby again, have her arrested for trespassing. No, Ebony, wait! Vivian shrieked, as the guards grabbed her by the arms, hauling her toward the private elevator. You cannot do this. We are family. You cannot let them laugh at us. Please, Ebony, please. Her screams faded as the heavy elevator doors slid shut, sealing her fate and removing her from my presence forever. The silence of the lounge wrapped around me a comforting, heavy blanket of absolute peace. I walked over to the wet bar, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. My hands were not shaking. My heart was beating in a slow, steady rhythm. The sickness of my family, the deep generational trauma of seeking validation through toxic men and fake wealth had finally been amputated from my life. I had watched them turn on each other like starving rats trapped in a sinking ship. I had watched Preston discard Chantel the moment she was no longer useful. I had watched my mother try to sell her daughter's soul to buy back her social standing. They were completely broken, utterly destroyed by their own vanity and greed. They wanted me to fund their delusions, but all I was going to do was sit back and watch them drown in the reality they had created. I walked back into my office, the sunlight streaming through the windows, warming my skin. The hardest part was over. The only thing left to do was to set the final trap for Preston and end this miserable chapter of my life with absolute terrifying finality. The night air was freezing and bitter, biting at my face as I walked away from the warehouse. The sound of Preston's pathetic sobbing was quickly drowned out by the harsh commands of the federal agents and the slamming of heavy vehicle doors. I did not look back. I slid into the back of my waiting SUV, pulling the soft cashmere coat tightly around my shoulders. Marcus closed the door behind me, sealing out the chaos and the flashing red and blue lights. The engine purred to life and we pulled away from the abandoned commercial lot, leaving the wreckage of Preston's life in the rear-view mirror. The drive back to the penthouse was a quiet victory lap. My phone was completely silent. The smear campaign, the desperate pleas, the gaslighting, and the financial manipulation were all finally over. Preston was sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence that would guarantee him a very long stay in a maximum security prison. The fake agreement had worked flawlessly, pulling him out of his hiding place and delivering him directly into the hands of the authorities. His absolute arrogance, his unwavering belief that he could simply outsmart and outmaneuver a black woman, had been his ultimate downfall. The next morning, the news cycle in Atlanta was dominated by the explosive fallout. I sat at my kitchen island drinking a cup of dark roast coffee and watching the local broadcasts. The footage of Preston being walked out of the warehouse in handcuffs was playing on a continuous loop. Reporters stood outside the federal courthouse detailing the massive scope of the embezzlement, the offshore accounts, and the seizure of the Vance brokerage assets. The narrative had completely shifted. There was no more talk of a misunderstanding or a bitter sister-in-law. The facts were laid bare for the entire city to see. My mother's desperate attempt to pay him off to save Chantal's marriage and their country club reputation was rendered utterly meaningless. Chantal was officially the wife of a convicted felon, a man who had stolen her father's legacy to fund a lavish lifestyle for a 22-year-old mistress. The social disgrace my mother had tried so frantically to avoid had crashed down upon them with the force of a hurricane. The church community that Vivian had tried to weaponize against me was now gossiping relentlessly about her ruined family. By noon, the final consequences of their financial ruin were set into motion. Selena called to confirm that the eviction notices for my parents' suburban mansion and Chantel's luxury home had been officially served. The properties were collateral for the toxic loans that Zenith Corporation had acquired, and with the brokerage completely liquidated, they had absolutely no way to pay the debt. They were given 30 days to vacate the premises. The sprawling homes they had used to project their fake superiority were being stripped away, returning to the bank to be sold off to the highest bidder. I expected the phone calls to start, and they did. The blocked voicemails piled up in my hidden folder, a pathetic chorus of desperation and bargaining. My father left messages begging for a restructuring plan, pleading with me to let them keep the house, offering to sign over whatever meaningless assets he thought he had left. Chantel left hysterical sobbing voicemails blaming everyone but herself, crying about how unfair the world was and how she had nowhere to go. But the most satisfying message came from my mother. Her voice was no longer arrogant or commanding. It was small, broken, and entirely defeated. "Ebony," she whispered into the phone, her words trembling with genuine fear. "They are taking the house. They are taking everything. Preston is gone. Your father is a mess. Please, you have the power to stop this. We are your family. We are all we have left. Please do not do this to us." I listened to the voicemail standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering obligation to the people who had treated me like disposable garbage my entire life. They had demanded I change my locks, sign a fake confession, and sacrifice my freedom to save a white criminal simply because they valued his optics over my existence. They had made their choices, and now the bill had finally come due. I picked up my phone and typed a single final text message to the family group chat before permanently blocking their numbers. "You wanted my keys. Now you do not even have your own. We are strangers now." I hit send and tossed the phone onto the sofa. The heavy, suffocating weight of the Vance family legacy was completely gone. I had not just survived their toxicity, I had systematically dismantled it, leaving them to rot in the ruins of their own delusions. I walked over to the dining table where my team was gathering for a celebratory lunch. Selena, Marcus, and the key members of my executive staff raised their glasses as I joined them. The sun poured into the penthouse, illuminating the faces of my chosen family. The people who respected my brilliance and stood by me in the trenches. I raised my glass of champagne, smiling out at the glittering Atlanta skyline. The empire was mine, and the air had never tasted so sweet. The abandoned commercial warehouse on the outskirts of Atlanta was a cavernous tomb of concrete and steel. It was one of the many distressed properties I had acquired during my systematic buyout of my father's ruined portfolio. The air inside was freezing, holding the bitter chill of a late November evening. Dust motes danced in the pale beams of moonlight that filtered through the high broken windows. There was no heat, no electricity, and absolutely no comfort. It was a barren, decaying shell that perfectly mirrored the current state of the Vance family legacy. I sat at a single metal folding table in the exact center of the vast, empty floor. A single battery-powered lead lantern sat on the table, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. Resting right next to the lantern was a sleek silver aluminum briefcase. I waited in the freezing silence, wearing a thick wool trench coat, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I did not feel the cold. The anticipation of the final strike kept my blood running warm. Marcus and my security team were hidden in the darkness of the upper catwalks, completely invisible, but watching every single square inch of the floor. Outside perimeter teams were already in position. Everything was meticulously arranged. The sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires broke the silence. Headlights swept across the frosted glass of the warehouse doors. The engine of a luxury sedan rumbled before being cut off. A heavy car door slammed shut, echoing loudly in the quiet industrial park. Footsteps approached the side entrance. The heavy metal door groaned on its rusted hinges, and Preston stepped into the warehouse. He was wearing a tailored navy blue overcoat over a crisp white dress shirt, his collar unbuttoned. Even now, facing a federal indictment and fleeing his ruined marriage, he carried himself with that same sickening, unearned arrogance. He stepped into the dim light of the lantern, looking around the decaying warehouse with an expression of profound disgust. He brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve and sneered. "Well, this is certainly fitting," Preston said, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "A distressed Class C commercial property with zero fundamental value. Just like your entire career. Ebony, I have to admit, when Vivian told me you were actually going to fund my exit strategy, I was surprised. But seeing you sitting here in this pathetic freezing dump, it makes sense. You are just a subordinate asset trying to buy your way into the big leagues." I did not say a word. I just looked at him, letting him fill the silence with his own delusional vanity. He walked toward the metal table, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He stopped just on the other side of the table, looking down at me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "You know your mother practically begged me on her hands and knees," Preston continued, leaning forward and placing his hands on the table. She was sobbing, blabbering about church gossip and social optics. It was pathetic, really. But it highlights a very important market dynamic, Ebony. Your family needs me. They need the proximity to my brand. They need my white-collar aesthetic to legitimize their desperate little social climbing operation. They are willing to leverage their own flesh and blood just to keep my name attached to their sinking ship. And you are just the liquidity bridge funding my golden parachute. I slowly pushed a single sheet of paper and a black pen across the metal table toward him. It was the non-disclosure agreement. The terms my mother had so desperately begged me to enforce. "Sign the document, Preston," I said, my voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "You sign this paper, relinquishing all claims to the Vance family assets, agreeing to a quiet divorce from Chantel, and confirming you will leave the state of Georgia by midnight. You sign it, and the briefcase is yours." Preston laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the empty warehouse. He picked up the pen, twirling it between his fingers. "Relinquishing my claims to what exactly?" he mocked. "Your father's brokerage is a toxic asset. It has been completely cannibalized. There is no equity left to claim. I drained that well dry months ago. But sure, I will sign your little NDA. It is a highly synergistic transaction for me." I get an untraceable capital injection, and you get to pretend you saved your sister's fragile little ego. He did not even glance at the fine print. He did not bother to read the carefully constructed clauses that explicitly waived his right to legal counsel in the event of an immediate federal arrest. He did not read the stipulations that legally bound him to a full admission of guilt regarding the wire fraud. His absolute staggering white privilege convinced him that he was untouchable. He believed he was sitting across from an inferior opponent. He assumed I was just a desperate black woman trying to clean up her family's mess, and he was the mastermind walking away with the prize. He scribbled his signature at the bottom of the page, pressing so hard the pen nearly tore the paper. He tossed the pen aside and slid the document back to me. "There you go," Preston said, his eyes locking onto the silver briefcase. "The exit strategy is officially executed. Now slide the capital over. I have a private charter waiting at a regional airstrip, and I do not want to keep Madison waiting." I placed my hand on top of the briefcase. I looked at him, taking in every detail of his smug face, the way his blue eyes gleamed with greed, the way his posture screamed entitlement. He really thought he had won. He really thought he had orchestrated the perfect corporate crime and was about to fly off to an island with his 22-year-old mistress, funded by the very woman he had tried to send to federal prison. I slowly pushed the heavy silver briefcase across the metal table. It slid with a quiet metallic scrape, stopping exactly in front of him. Preston did not hesitate. He lunged for it, his fingers fumbling eagerly with the dual combination latches. The lock snapped open with a heavy, satisfying click. He threw the lid back, expecting to see rows of untraceable bearer bonds, expecting to see $1 million in pure financial freedom. Instead, the briefcase was completely empty, save for a single plain manila folder resting at the bottom. Preston's smile froze, his brow furrowed in confusion. He stared down into the empty silver void, his brain struggling to process the visual information. He looked up at me, his face twisting into a scowl of annoyance. "What is this?" Preston demanded, his voice losing its smooth corporate cadence. "Where are the bonds?" "Ebony. If this is some kind of negotiation tactic, you are wildly miscalculating your leverage." "Open the folder," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper. He hesitated, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing his eyes for the first time all evening. He reached down and pulled the manila folder from the briefcase. He flipped it open. The first document on the top of the stack was a federal subpoena issued by the United States Department of Justice. Printed in bold black letters across the top was his name, Preston Thomas Vance. Underneath the subpoena was a highly classified alert from the Department of Homeland Security. It was a printed confirmation that his passport had been officially flagged and revoked. He was placed on the federal no-fly list. Preston's hands began to shake. The papers rattled against each other as he stared at the terrifying reality printed on the page. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. He flipped frantically through the rest of the pages, finding printed copies of every single offshore wire transfer he had ever made, every fake invoice he had ever drafted, and every email he had ever sent to his mistress using stolen funds. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He dropped the folder back into the briefcase as if it had burned him. He stumbled backward, hitting the metal table and sending the LED lantern sliding. "What is this?" Preston stammered, his voice pitching up into a panicked whine. "How did you get this? This is classified federal information. You cannot have this." I stood up from my folding chair, rising to my full height. I looked at him with a lifetime of pent-up rage and absolute cold calculation. "Did you really think a black woman who built an empire from scratch would fund a mediocre white man's escape?" I asked, my words cutting through the freezing air like a blade. "Did you genuinely believe that I navigated the most ruthless venture capital rooms in the country, built a multi-million-dollar data analytics platform, and acquired a corporate monopoly just to hand over a briefcase full of cash to a glorified con artist?" Preston took another step back, his eyes darting frantically around the dark, empty warehouse. "You set me up," he gasped, his voice breaking. "You called the feds. You are working with them." "I did not just call them, Preston. I replied, stepping around the table and walking slowly toward him. I handed them your entire life on a silver platter. I tracked your offshore accounts when the FBI hit a dead end. I provided the algorithmic proof of your wire fraud. I bought my father's debt just so I could trap you in this exact moment. You thought you could use my identity to hide your crimes because you saw me as an easy target. You thought your whiteness and your tailored suits made you invisible, but my data exposed exactly what you are. A pathetic, desperate thief who ruined a family just to stroke his own ego. You bitch! Preston screamed, his fear suddenly morphing into violent, panicked rage. He lunged forward, raising his fist to strike me. He did not even make it half a step. The massive corrugated steel doors at the front of the warehouse suddenly exploded open with a deafening crash. Blinding high-intensity tactical lights flooded the dark space, completely blinding Preston. The piercing wail of police sirens shattered the silence of the industrial park. A fleet of black sport utility vehicles screeched into the warehouse, their tires squealing against the concrete floor. "FBI, do not move! Get your hands in the air!" a voice roared through a megaphone. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents swarmed the building, pouring in from the front doors, the side exits, and the upper catwalks. Red laser sights cut through the dusty air, centering directly on Preston's chest. Preston screamed in pure animalistic terror. He spun around, trying to sprint toward the back exit, but Marcus and my private security team had already dropped down from the stairs, blocking his path. An FBI tactical team rushed him from the side. Preston flailed his arms, fighting blindly, throwing punches and screaming corporate jargon in a complete mental breakdown. "I am an investment manager," he shrieked as two federal agents grabbed his arms. "You cannot do this to me. I know people. I have connections." An agent swept Preston's legs out from under him. The golden son-in-law. The man my parents had worshipped as a god was violently slammed face first onto the cold, hard hood of a federal vehicle. The sickening crunch of his expensive watch smashing against the metal echoed in the warehouse. The agents pinned his arms behind his back, the metal handcuffs ratcheting incredibly tight around his wrists. "Stop, please," Preston sobbed. His face pressed against the hood of the car, his nose bleeding from the impact. He was weeping uncontrollably, his entire facade of superiority stripped away in an instant. "Please, I do not want to go to prison. I will give the money back. Tell them, Ebony. Tell them we had an agreement." I walked slowly over to the vehicle, looking down at him. The tactical lights illuminated his tear-streaked face, his perfectly styled hair now a tangled mess. His privilege was completely dismantled, crushed under the weight of his own hubris and my meticulous planning. "We did have an agreement, Preston," I said, my voice perfectly calm despite the chaos of the flashing sirens and shouting agents. "You agreed to relinquish everything, and now you have." I turned my back on him as the federal agents hauled him up from the hood of the car, dragging his sobbing, thrashing body toward the back of an armored transport vehicle. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, trapping him inside his new reality. I buttoned my cashmere coat, pulling it tight against the bitter winter chill, and walked out of the warehouse, leaving the ruin of Preston Vance behind me forever. The weeks that followed the raid at the warehouse moved with the swift, undeniable force of absolute justice. Preston's high-priced lawyer, the one he thought would shield him from the consequences of his arrogance, dropped him the exact moment the federal asset freeze hit his accounts. Without stolen money to pay the exorbitant retainer fee, Preston was left entirely to the mercy of a public defender who looked at the mountain of irrefutable digital evidence I had provided and immediately advised him that going to trial would be a suicide mission. There was no bail hearing that ended in his favor. The federal judge looked at the flight risk he posed, especially after seeing the revoked passport, the offshore accounts, and the details of his attempted escape that night at the warehouse. Preston Vance, the golden boy of the Atlanta Country Club circuit, the man my parents had worshipped as a financial deity, was forced to accept a harsh plea deal. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The day he was transferred, I watched the brief news clip of him shuffling onto a transport bus, He traded his custom-tailored Italian suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his hands and ankles bound in heavy iron chains. His white privilege, the very shield he had used to manipulate my black family and steal millions of dollars, proved to be entirely useless against the cold, hard reality of federal sentencing guidelines. He looked pale, terrified, and utterly broken. The arrogant smirk was permanently erased from his face. Chantel was left standing in the smoking rubble of her manufactured life. The luxury cars were repossessed in the middle of the night by silent tow truck drivers. Her designer wardrobe, her expensive jewelry, and her curated art collection were all seized by federal agents to pay back a tiny fraction of the millions her husband had stolen from his investors and my father's brokerage. But the ultimate blow came from the federal government itself. In her desperate, pathetic need to maintain the illusion of being a wealthy, devoted wife, Chantel had blindly signed every single joint tax return Preston had ever placed in front of her. She never read the fine print. She never asked questions about the phantom income or the massive deductions. She had essentially signed her own name to years of blatant federal tax fraud. The Internal Revenue Service descended upon her with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. Her personal bank accounts were permanently frozen. Her credit score was completely destroyed, and she was facing a barrage of relentless audits that would financially cripple her for the rest of her natural life. She was left completely penniless. The friends she used to gossip with at the country club stopped taking her calls. The women at the church pretended they did not see her when she walked by. The disgraced socialite was forced to pack a single suitcase of basic clothing and beg for space on the couches of distant acquaintances. She had absolutely nothing to show for her toxic loyalty to a man who had shoved her to the floor and called her an idiot. My parents did not fare any better in the aftermath of their colossal failure. Zenith Corporation's foreclosure on the Vance brokerage assets was finalized without a single legal hitch. The bank moved in swiftly and seized their sprawling suburban mansion in Fairfield. I actually received a copy of the eviction notice crossing my desk, and I signed off on it with a steady hand. I watched the news footage from a local helicopter camera as the moving trucks arrived at the grand estate, packing up the meager remnants of Jerome and Vivian Vance's lavish facade. The church community they had tried to weaponize against me turned their backs completely. The pastors and the gossiping aunties, who had eagerly listened to my mother's lies, wanted absolutely nothing to do with a family so deeply entangled in federal fraud and public humiliation. Jerome and Vivian were forced to pack whatever basic belongings they were allowed to keep and move into a tiny, run-down two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The walls of their new home were paper-thin, the appliances were ancient and broken, and the view from their single window was a brick wall covering an alleyway. It was a far cry from the opulent lifestyle they had literally sold my soul to maintain. They were stripped of their pride, their status, and their stolen wealth. My father could not show his face in the commercial real estate circles he used to dominate, and my mother was reduced to shopping at discount grocery stores, looking over her shoulder to make sure no one from her old life recognized her. As their reality crumbled around them, the desperate phone calls began. I sat in my spacious penthouse office, the afternoon sun pouring through the glass, staring at my phone as the blocked audio files dropped into my voicemail folder one by one. It was a pathetic symphony of regret that came far too late. My mother Vivian called day and night, leaving long, weeping messages that echoed through the quiet, serene space of my office. "Ebony? Please," she sobbed, her voice cracking and wet with the strain of her new miserable existence. "Please pick up the phone. We are living in an absolute nightmare. Your father is sick with stress. His heart cannot take this kind of shame, and Chantel just cries all day on our lumpy sofa. We have nothing left. Ebony. We lost the beautiful house, we lost the family business, we lost all our friends at the church. I know we made terrible mistakes. I know we were wrong about Preston, and we were so very wrong about you. You are a brilliant girl, and we should have seen that. But you have to help us now. You have the power and the money to fix this. We are your family, Ebony. Blood is thicker than water. Family is all we have in this miserable world. Please, you cannot leave your own mother and father living like this. You have to save us." I listened to her tears, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no warmth, no guilt, no lingering sense of obligation pulling at my chest. She was not crying because she had hurt me. She was not apologizing for telling me to change my locks or trying to force me to sign a fake confession that would have put me in prison. She was crying because she was suffering the consequences of her own terrible actions. She was mourning the loss of her massive square footage, her designer shoes, and her country club status, not the loss of her youngest daughter. She had abandoned me the very moment it was socially convenient for her, and now she expected me to throw a multi-million-dollar lifeline to a sinking ship she had intentionally steered directly into a violent storm. I picked up my phone, feeling the smooth, cool metal in my hand. I did not call her back. I did not want to hear her voice live or give her the opportunity to manipulate the conversation with fake tears and empty promises of becoming a real mother. I opened our text message thread, the exact same thread where she had once demanded I surrender my freedom for a white con artist. I typed out a single final message, measuring every word with the precise heavy weight of absolute closure. "You wanted my keys?" I typed, my fingers steady and calm against the glass screen. "You tried to steal my home and my freedom just to save your own fragile social image. Now you do not even have your own keys. You have absolutely nothing because you valued a lie and a racist thief over your own flesh and blood. We are strangers now. Do not ever contact me again." I hit send. I watched the small gray text bubble appear and waited for the little notification to confirm that the message had been delivered to her cheap prepaid phone. Then, with one smooth, definitive motion, I went into my contacts menu. I permanently blocked my mother's number. I blocked my father's number. I blocked Chantel. I purged their digital existence from my life, completely locking them out of my world forever. The toxic cord was officially cut. The generational cycle of abuse and conditional love was completely broken, and I was finally entirely free to breathe. Months passed, sweeping away the bitter cold of winter and giving way to a vibrant, lush Atlanta spring. The Zenith Tower stood tall and gleaming against the bright blue sky, a massive monument of glass and steel to the empire I had built with my own two hands and my own brilliant mind. My business was thriving, expanding into new global markets and revolutionizing the property technology sector at a pace that shocked even my most optimistic investors. I had not just recovered from my family's vicious attempt to destroy me. I had used their wreckage as the foundation to fuel my ascent to the absolute pinnacle of the real estate industry. It was a warm, breezy Friday evening, and the sprawling rooftop terrace of my penthouse was bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun. The air smelled of blooming jasmine and expensive gourmet catering. Soft instrumental jazz played from the hidden outdoor speakers, setting the perfect mood for a victory celebration. I was hosting a private dinner party, but the guest list did not include a single blood relative. Instead, the massive terrace was filled entirely with my true family. The chosen family who had stood by me when the fire was burning its absolute hottest. Selena. My brilliant, fierce corporate attorney was laughing by the sleek marble outdoor bar, her sharp legal mind finally taking a well-deserved rest after successfully dismantling my father's empire. Marcus, my towering head of security, was chatting casually with my lead software engineers, swapping stories, and enjoying the incredible spread of roasted lamb and seafood my private chef had prepared. My venture capital investors, my mentors, and my fiercely loyal friends were all gathered together, creating an atmosphere of genuine love, deep respect, and mutual success. There was no fake posturing, no toxic competition, and no underlying malice hiding behind forced smiles. It was just pure, authentic black joy. I walked over to the edge of the terrace, resting my hands on the cool, thick glass railing. The sprawling city of Atlanta stretched out infinitely below me, an endless sea of glittering lights and pulsing, vibrant energy. I looked down at the dark grid of streets far below where my parents were currently struggling in complete obscurity, where Chantel was facing her endless legal nightmares, and where Preston was locked away in a tiny concrete cell, staring at a steel wall for the next 15 years. They were all down there trapped permanently in the suffocating consequences of their own immense greed and prejudice, and I was up here breathing the clean, rare air of absolute total victory. Selena walked over to me, her heels clicking softly against the deck. She handed me a crystal flute filled with the finest vintage champagne. She smiled, looking out at the gorgeous skyline, and then turned back to me, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it, Ebony," she said softly, her voice filled with profound, deep respect. "You built the empire and you protected the throne. You actually did it." I took the glass, my fingers wrapping securely around the delicate crystal stem. I thought back to that miserable, stifling birthday dinner where my mother had tried to publicly humiliate me in front of strangers. I thought about the stolen keys, the fake federal confession, the church smear campaign, and the desperate, pathetic attempts to tear me down and steal my life. They had thrown every weapon they had at me, expecting me to shatter into a million pieces like fragile glass. But I did not shatter. I weaponized their underestimation. I turned their gross arrogance into a fatal trap, and their insatiable greed into an inescapable cage. I looked out over the glittering skyline, gazing at the city that I now held firmly in the palm of my hand. I raised my glass of champagne, the golden bubbles catching the fading amber light of the setting sun. I did not just survive them. I whispered into the warm evening breeze, taking a slow, victorious sip of the cold, sweet champagne. I conquered them. The jazz music swelled beautifully in the background. The genuine laughter of my chosen family filled the warm night air, and the vibrant lights of my city burned brighter than ever before. Fade to black. The most profound takeaway from this story is that your self-worth is never defined by those who are committed to misunderstanding you. Blood relations do not automatically guarantee loyalty, and you are under no obligation to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. True power comes from silencing the noise of unfair expectations, executing your goals with quiet discipline, and letting your undeniable success be your only response to disrespect. When you stop craving validation from people who constantly tear you down, you become entirely unstoppable. You don't just survive their underestimation, you build an empire on it. If this story inspired you to set firmer boundaries and recognize your own true worth, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own power.